First of all, thanks to the three speakers before, as well as you, Linxiu. That was a very interesting set of keynotes, and I won't say any more about that right now, but it really led nicely into this breakout group. I'll just say very briefly that I've been involved with sustainable development for many, many years now. I view that it's extremely important, and the science of sustainability is, in fact, very, very important, as we've already seen, and we'll hear more in this session. So I would like to say no more than that about myself, but I did want to introduce the point of this particular breakout group. And I'm just going to read a little bit. It's about biodiversity, climate, and livelihoods. And as both Linxiu and I well know, we both kind of specialize in looking at things like connections, the nexus approach, things like bringing together climate and biodiversity. And I particularly like that idea of looking at this from the perspective of making nature, which includes climate matters, of course, as a very, something that really has to be very much in the front these days, and for this whole decade and perhaps forever, of course, on Earth. And in addition, though, we introduce and think about these idea of livelihoods. There's many different ways of looking at it. We've heard some already, but we'll hear a lot more during this, hopefully during this session we're having now. So I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs of how we see this. Ecosystem health is being damaged by climate change, in turn causing loss of livelihoods, food insecurity, and other socioeconomic effects at community and regional levels within countries. Together, these impacts make it more difficult to break these very vicious poverty cycles and can worsen ecological degradation and biodiversity loss. I'm sure that's not very new to anybody that's listening in on this, but what is, I think, still quite new is this idea of a nexus approach, which examines the interdependencies among key components of what I would call complex socio-ecological systems. And we've already heard about how important these are, is that they have to be tapped into at the community level, indigenous peoples, etc. When combined with adaptive planning and management, so we learn as we go, such research can lead to better outcomes, such as low carbon rural development, which I think is, for so many countries, very, very essential. Protection of ecological services and sustainable livelihoods, not just livelihoods, but sustainable livelihoods. This approach emphasizes livelihood improvement to break cycles of poverty while restoring ecosystems and helping local communities to adapt to climate change. So in this effort, and there's lots of people out there in the preparations for COP15 that's going to take place in Kunming in October, working with nature is necessary to create local prosperity and a better quality of life. The benefits cannot be optimized without significant policy realignments, what I would say transformative change, and I'm glad to see that point has been emphasized by some of our speakers already. Long-term financial investment and capacity development at local levels. And I think, as an example, the green recovery ideas from the COVID-19 pandemic is a prime case for considering a nexus approach. It has to take nature into account. So we have two questions that we wanted to bring forward for speakers to think about, but also perhaps some of the questions that people in the audience will be able to help expand on. Successful policy requires understanding of the relationship between nature and livelihoods. What gaps in science still need to be filled? And that's a tough question. It's a very tough question. The second question is, on the management side, what are the enabling conditions for better solutions to the intertwined crises of biodiversity and ecosystem, on the one hand, climate change, and livelihoods? So linking those three things together is what we're really trying to understand. So we have five different people that are here. I don't want to take from their time, so I'm just going to very quickly go through a few things about each of them at the beginning now, and then that'll save us time during the actual presentations. Dr. Ivar Baste of Norway is the co-chair for the future of UNEP's Global Environment Outlook, the GEO series. He also has been deeply involved as a report lead in UNEP's synthesis report, Making Peace with Nature. And I just want to say, if those of you out there have not read this document, it really is worth reading. It's been put together by a number of different groups, and I found it very enlightening. Our second speaker will be Dr. Lin Li, who's a close colleague of mine and who we've worked jointly on various things on biodiversity. And she leads and coordinates World Wildlife Fund's global efforts in cross-cutting policy positions and advocacy approaches on nature, focusing on biodiversity and the SDGs particularly. And she is involved in many different policy dialogues. And before that, she was the executive program director for WWF China. The third person is Professor Joyeeta Gupta, Professor of Environment and Development in the Global South at the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research of the University of Amsterdam and at the Delft Institute for Water Education. She is a faculty professor on sustainability for the next several years, these crucial years that get us between the first 2 decades and the third decade of this century. And she has been named the co-chair of the Earth Commission 2019 to 2021 by Future Earth. Professor Shenggen Fan, I work in China, I should have got that a lot easier than I did. He is currently chair professor and dean of Academy of Global Food Economics and Policy at the China Agricultural University. And prior to that, he was a director general of a very important body, IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, which I feel is one of the most insightful organizations in dealing with food issues. And then Dr. Linxiu Zhang, who needs no introduction because she was just on, but I'll say it anyways, that she's a UNEP senior staff member who is the director of the UN Environment Program International Ecosystem Partnership, which partners with, among others, the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So that's our panel. And what we're going to do, and I hate doing this, but we're going to try and keep very much on schedule. So there will be 8 minutes, and I've got a clock in front of me. I'll be tracking it very carefully. And so please try and stay within your 8-minute limit as speaker. And I'm going to start off with Ivar, if you could proceed.
Basically thought of starting with the same questions that you posed and try to sort of speak a little bit around them. So first thing, and I'd like to show a few of infographics from the report, Making Peace with Nature, the synthesis report that you just very nicely spoke about. So thanks a lot for that. Let me first just start with the fact that most of us can sort of feel rather insignificant in comparison with the vast Earth, and many of us might wonder sort of, well, how on earth may the level of human impact really impact the environment that much? But one of the things clearly is that it's our collective impacts that matter, and one of my favorite telling numbers are the ratio of meat weight, sheer meat weight of mammals on Earth, as seen on this slide. Thing is that the combined biomass of mammals, then human population really constitutes a third, and livestock nearly 2/3, and we're only left with less than 5% wild mammals on Earth, and that's everything from whales to mice. So with that sort of starting on that note, let me draw your attention to sort of one of the main infographics of the report, Making Peace with Nature, which was called for also by the UN Secretary General. Let's have a look and see sort of how humans now dominate the Earth and what the consequences are. So if we look at the left hand pink side of the infographic, we see that over the last 50 years, trade has grown staggering tenfold. The global economy has grown nearly fivefold, and the world population has doubled. Yes, on average, prosperity has also doubled, but still about 1.3 billion people remain poor, and some 700 million are hungry. And these numbers, we know, have increased during the pandemic. So if we look at the disposal of waste matter, for instance, we see that the emission of heat trapping greenhouse gases has doubled over the last 50 years, and nature is only able to absorb about half of it. Current concentrations of carbon dioxide is higher than any time in the past 800,000 years. It means that temperature is rising 1 degree now compared with the latter half of last century. We are on a pathway to 3 degrees. Current warming has already led to climatic shifts. I think we all know that. Chemical production, waste and pollution have increased, was a main motivation for the Stockholm conference 50 years ago. Still today, pollution causes annually about 9 million premature deaths. If we look at space and resources, we see that, well, human development is largely fueled by a tripling of the extraction of natural resources and energy over the past 50 years. The economy has grown more, and some of that is due to increased efficiency, but we are really far from decoupling the economy from environmental degradation. That's also evident from the use of space. 3/4 of land and 2/3 of the oceans are now impacted by humans, as the IPBES report told us a few years ago. 1/4 of land has been radically transformed to cropland plantations, other use. And if we continue on this path, the remaining 25% of near natural land is projected to be only 10% by 2050. We share the earth with many, many life forms, and we certainly have passed their capacity to sustain our impacts. We displace them through use of land and seas. If we don't displace them, we eat them or we exploit them in other ways. We pollute their environment, alter their climate, and facilitate the spread of invasive species. And we know that about 1 million of the world's 8 million species are threatened with extinctions. And as we all, I think, are very well aware of, population sizes, abundance of many species are plummeting ecosystems and continue to be degraded, and their contribution likewise. So the baseline really is that today's increasing unequal resource-intensive development model degrades and surpasses the Earth's finite capacity to sustain human well-being. Our transformation of nature has yielded development gains, yes, but this transformation is increasingly putting human well-being at risk. So, for instance, GDP completely overstates economic or overstates human progress because it doesn't account for natural capital, which some studies have shown constitute at least some 20% of planetary wealth. Anyway, we need to turn our attention then to transforming humankind's relationship with nature. And for that, we definitely need new science. And that's the overarching answer to the first question you posed to us, Art. But we need to get that right. We need to start from the right spot in a way. And first, we must start by focusing on what it takes to restore the Earth's capacity to sustain human well-being, and what it takes for society to adapt to it, as indicated in the right-hand side of this infographic. And that means actually transforming human relation with nature without surrendering hard-won development gains, also still honoring the rightful aspirations of poor nations and people to enjoy a better living standard. So the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework really need to reflect the challenge, and it is really a systemic challenge. And the next decade, as other speakers today have pointed to, is really crucial. So what are the enabling conditions for solving the intertwined crisis? Posed in the second question to the group. Well, we have to mobilize human knowledge, ingenuity, technology, and cooperation so that we transform societies and economies. This transformation will have to involve fundamental changes in technological and economic and social organization of society, including our worldviews and norms and values and governance. And these major shifts also requires investments, and regulations are really key to achieving change. And then we will also definitely meet vested interests, but that are also often legitimate, and there are ways of tackling them through setting long-term objectives, putting in place regulations, and using financial instruments. Well, let me conclude by showing you another final infographic from the report. We live in a polycentric world with lots of partly interacting, partly autonomous decision-making entities, and how on earth do we make sure that everyone does their part? The first thing is that we need to make sure that everyone signs up for a common vision, and we need to empower people to express themselves, act environmentally responsibly without undue difficulty or self-sacrifice. So the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is an opportunity for reinvigorating the vision, and it can help us also reflect that keeping the planet healthy is key to providing healthy communities and well-being for all. So we've homed in on kind of three major things there. First of all, we need to address the Earth's environmental emergencies and well-being together. It means that international environmental agreements, for instance, need to be aligned and become much more mutually supportive. I think that's a key message to bring with us to the Conference of Parties with the major agreements now when they meet this year. Secondly, we need to transform the economic and financial systems so that they lead and power the shift to sustainability. And in order to do that, we need to account for natural capital, invest in sustainability, and eliminate the harmful subsidies. And we point in our report to the fact that the combined value of direct subsidies to fossil fuels, agriculture, fisheries, transport, and their social and environmental costs, they exceed some staggering $5 trillion per year. And many of the subsidies could be redirected and the cost to society captured in taxes and fees and to fund the green transition. So this is very much about sort of reconstructing the world economic and financial system. Finally, that will actually be my last point almost, is actually that we need to transform food, water, and energy systems to meet the growing human needs in an equitable and resilient and environmentally friendly manner. And just one example, a move towards much more of a plant-based diet has the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 20%. It has health benefits, it has benefits for biodiversity. So it's really also critical to reduce the food, water, and waste. So I'll just sort of say one thing, and that is that we have also then in the report homed in on a number of different actors and what their role are in order to sort of achieve a joint mission, and they're sort of listed in this slide as well. And with that, I thank you for for the time given to me, and sorry for going over a bit.
It's okay. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I'm going to now move, if I can, to Li-Lin.
So thanks for giving me this opportunity to share thoughts. I think when we were coming together with the challenge, intertwined challenge between science, between climate, nature, and the land use, I think it's good to really look at what is that kind of targets we can set in together. So my talk is mostly talking about how can we have a global goal for nature that can really combining our use of ecosystems and species, so that we can really have a nature that sustains us by the end of the century. So my talk is to really talk about this global goal for nature. No need to further say we are entering a Anthropocene era where humans' action really altered the nature ground to the extent that's never happened before in the history. We know that on the surface, we see the loss of nature, loss of biodiversity, but behind the scene, as the IPBES reporting, that the direct drivers of the loss of biodiversity and ecosystems are habitat loss, over-exploration, climate change with the biggest pollution and invasive species. Therefore, to addressing this intertwined, interlinked challenge that we're facing, we have to think about something that can really combine all the actions together. So with the most two that at hand, one is really the climate change curve, the greenhouse gas emission keep on climbing, where the where the living planet index, the species population keep on declining. So in the next 10 years, we are having an opportunity to really reverse the true trend. And today I'm mostly focusing on the nature part. Really, how do we really reverse the loss of nature? This need a effort that coming from all parts, all shares of world. So in the last year, more than 120 countries coming together, 65 head of states coming together to talk about in the Biodiversity Summit in New York City. Along that side, there are a group of head of states coming together to really endorse the leaders' pledge for nature, to unite to reverse the biodiversity loss by 2030 for sustainable development. And I'd like to share with you now what they have been talking.
Our planet is in a state of emergency.
Biodiversity loss is an urgent threat to health, food supplies, and livelihoods across the globe.
Both climate change and the loss of biodiversity have devastating consequences.
Estamos aún a tiempo de revertir la espiral de destrucción biológica en que vivimos, adoptando medidas urgentes.
The interests of our peoples and our planet have never been more strongly aligned.
We want a real common movement for change. Now is the time to act.
I endorse the Leaders' Pledge for Nature.
I endorse the Leaders' Pledge for Nature.
And commit to take urgent actions.
Urgent actions.
Urgent actions.
So that united,
we can reverse biodiversity loss
by 2030.
By 2030.
For sustainable development.
I endorse
the Leaders' Pledge for Nature.
I endorse the Leaders' Pledge for Nature.
Of the Leaders' Pledge for Nature.
I endorse the Leaders' Pledge for Nature.
For sustainable development.
We have a duty to preserve the biodiversity of life on Earth, as conserving nature is not just a moral issue, but it is also a question of survival.
We must turn these words into action and make the changes we need to achieve them.
Let us all put our hearts together to protect and help heal this planet before it is too late.
We must make Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework a turning point.
Our health and the health of our planet depend on an equitable, carbon-neutral future where we value and protect our natural spaces.
It is not the judgment of history I fear the most, but that of my children and grandchildren. I call on all leaders to rally around this cause and rapidly move towards this transformative change.
So this is what the leaders has been telling us, and they address the issue we're facing, and they're also calling for the action, starting from themselves. So from the conservation point of view, if we can get the nature agenda to the highest possible place where we can see the strongest political signal coming from the highest level to call for the actions in the next 10 years. That's great. So currently we have 85 head of states plus EU. Number is 84 is just obsolete. One more joined. Plus the EU has endorsed this action, and they are calling for taking action on nature. Now, in the next 2 minutes, I will talk about where to land this. So we have one opportunity in the next 10 years to see, this is the future we like to see, right? Nature positive means that by 2030, the loss of nature has been revised, and we can see more, there's more nature. We have a nature positive, more nature in 2030 than we have now to really help us to reach the 2050 goal where we live in harmony with nature. And to achieve this, the point of the Global Biodiversity Framework is critical. And we as WWF and with many other players, we propose that the 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework really put the reverse loss of nature, be nature positive by 2030 as its goal in 2030, so that we can starting to see the nature become positive to contributing to nature, to people's well-being. In addition to the ecosystems, species, sustainable use, the drivers for nature loss, we need to also look into how to implement that once we agreed the Global Biodiversity Framework in Kunming later this year. So we like to see in this framework, there are 5 must-haves, must-wins in there. We need a mission in 2030 to reverse loss of nature. We need to have the impact of a human being, the impact of our production and consumption, the footprint. We need to have them so that we'll be able to have nature to preserve. We need a strong and effective implementation mechanism to really bring the impact we need. We need a comprehensive resource mobilization to remove harmful investment incentives, to align the financial flows, and to double the financial flows towards developing countries for implementing the biodiversity. Eventually, we need a whole of government, whole of society, rights-based approach so that we can together to reach a goal where we can have nature reversed to provide the services and need of a human being. So global goal nature positive is something we should aim for. And thank you. Back to you, Arthur.
Thank you very much, Li-Lin. And I would just like to say 2 things. One is that if you haven't looked at the Leaders' Pledge, you should. It's easy to get online, of course. And I find that it was really quite moving, actually. It's a very detailed, and I'm glad, I wish all the leaders had signed up to it, but maybe that'll happen before Kunming takes place in October. And the second thing is that I think we should take heed of your last slide. There's a lot of good information in those 5 points that you made there at the end. And so maybe we can come back to that at some point. Okay, thank you very much, Li-Lin. I'd now like to move on to Professor Joyeeta Gupta.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to pick off where Lin Li left off and talk about addressing biodiversity drivers. And essentially, we know that our leaders want to do something, but the key issue is how do you design your instruments? Now, we know that values lead to instrument design, and for each value, there's a counter value. So if our value is to protect livelihoods, then we need to adopt instruments that actually focus on livelihoods. And if we do not do that, then what ultimately happens is we pick the wrong instrument, and then ultimately the impact is that you may promote socio-ecological justice, or you may in fact reproduce injustice. Now we know, of course, that biodiversity loss and land loss and climate change affect human health. And for example, land degradation affects 3.2 billion people at a cost of between $4 to $20 trillion per annum. Loss of biopollinators is also a very big problem, as well as zoonosis being 60% of all infectious disease. Now, if you really want to focus on land and the people who live on the land, then we need to focus also on indigenous peoples and local communities. But in this particular graph that comes from the Global Environment Outlook, what we see is that many of the forests are actually owned much more by either government or increasingly by the private sector. But it is precisely the indigenous communities and local communities that are really good at protecting biodiversity. So we may have to redesign our mechanisms to enable that. If we look, for example, at who owns land, and we look at the fact that in many countries in the world, women are not allowed to inherit land, for example, as you can see in this map, especially in countries marked red, what you find is that this affects the ability of women to contribute as small farmers to food security. And this issue of gender ownership of land is a very critical one in trying to address biodiversity and agriculture, food security in terms of the global community. Now, we know that 1 million of the world's estimated 8 million plants and animal species are threatened with extinction, and the key direct drivers include change in land and sea use, direct exploitation, and climate change. amongst others. So clearly, when you design an instrument, the instrument must try to address land and sea use change, as well as direct exploitation and climate change. But we know that despite the fact that we have a large number of targets in relation to biodiversity, the progress towards achieving those targets is rather limited. We can see that through the IPBES Global Assessment and the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which have assessed the literature, and they conclude, and you can see that in red, that many of these targets have not been achieved. Why is that the case? One of the reasons why goals don't get achieved is because the instruments that develop, shown in red on the left side, often do not take into account the existing drivers and pressures and contexts that influence human activities. So when we design these instruments, we must take into account the drivers and pressures as well as the context. Otherwise, we will not achieve our goals. Now, in the Global Environment Outlook, we looked at these underlying drivers, and they included, amongst other things, urbanization, growth, the focus on GDP, technology, which both enhances welfare but can be extremely risky and enables rapid misuse of land sometimes, and of course, climate change. And if climate change has now become a major driver of biodiversity loss, the only way we can achieve goals such as full recovery by 2050 of biodiversity is if we can also address climate change seriously. But when we look at the drivers, it's not simply enough to look at what are the causes, but we also need to look at the equity issues. So how do drivers result from, mitigate, or exacerbate inequalities? Who uses and pollutes resources and sinks? How is exposure to benefits and risks distributed? How are impacts distributed? Who is able to adapt? Who pays for residual damages? And how do responses redistribute rights, risks, and responsibilities? So we do have to build in equity into our value system when we design our instruments. In this particular figure, you see on the x-axis, the privileged on the left, the marginalized on the right. And you see on the y-axis, the contribution to drivers and pressures. And what you can see is that those who are privileged contribute significantly more to causing the problem, either through their production and consumption patterns or through their investment patterns or savings. And so, for example, the richest 10% emit 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions, or the meat consumption in the US is twice that of India and Africa combined. And so what you see is that the poorer countries really use very much less. Lin just told us that we need to halve our footprint, but in fact, this basically means that Western countries and rich people worldwide have to significantly reduce their footprint to make some space for low-income countries to increase their footprint. However, if you look at who is actually affected, then we find it is the marginalized who are affected in an existential term from the impacts of climate change loss and biodiversity loss. And we are seeing already that low-income countries are losing 5% of their GDP impacts of climate change, or more than 400 million women farmers own only 20% of their land, which makes it very difficult for them to actually invest in that land. So what we see basically is that those who cause the problem are not necessarily those who are badly affected by the problem. And this basically requires us to think about what is our value system when we really try to address these problems of biodiversity, environment, and land use change. In this particular figure, we see that all these emergencies are intertwined, and clearly land degradation and deforestation lead to greater greenhouse gas emissions, increased drought, and loss of carbon sinks, while climate change itself leads to a shift in biomes, regional desertification, increased droughts, fire, and regional water stress. So we see that all these systems are interlinked, and we really have to try to address all of them simultaneously. And in this wedding cake representation of environmental degradation, we see that climate change and biodiversity loss are affected significantly. And this basically leads to hampering the efforts to make cities and communities more sustainable, as well as weakens food and water security. And these two together imply that it's more difficult to eliminate poverty or to address the risks affecting human health. And we basically know that in 2018, damages from climate-related natural disasters cost the world around $155 billion US. And so to come to my conclusions, when we know that up till now, since 1972, we've almost had 50 years of knowledge on climate change and biodiversity, and we also have had the development of instruments. But none of these instruments have been able to adequately turn the tide of environmental destruction. And that is because many of them have tried to address the pressures, but very few of them have tried to address the underlying drivers, such as how we define GDP growth. And this is really critical. And the other issue that I find is a big problem is that the equity elements have not been adequately taken into account. The systemic relationships between these different environmental problems have not been accounted for. So if we want these to succeed, we really have to design instruments that address pressures as well as drivers, address context, account for equity, and address systemic relationships. Environmental policy has too long been inadequate to address pressures and drivers. And so in my view, we really need a quantum jump in the way international law is designed to be able to address these issues. And I will just give you a last example. If you look at Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals, then although the goals seem to look quite good, in fact, even though we talk about global partnerships, etc., the Sustainable Development Goals also talk about full permanent sovereignty. And this goes against global collaboration. And that is my big worry, that in spite of the fact that we're talking about countries collaborating, there is a great fear that countries may start to work on their own priorities and ignore the need for equity in resolving global issues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joyeeta. That was a fantastic presentation. You hit on so many points. I wish we could spend an hour on it. And I hope that these presentations will be up there long enough for people to sit back and absorb that very rich content. If I could just say a couple of things. One is this idea of poly-governance. You can't respond on this now, but this word poly-governance. Another one is resilience. I'm just going to start my, there's my video. And this idea of resilience is a very important word, and it's used in so many different ways, particularly in this COVID period. How do we define terms like this, and how do we get at some of these points that you made in the last part of it, all of which come back not only to talk about the policy side, but in many cases linked to science as well. But I think your fundamental message of systemic problems is one that we really have to bring forward when we pull this all together. So thank you very much now, and I really appreciated that presentation. So now, Professor Shenggen.
So I don't have any PowerPoints to make you guys' life much easier. So, you know, all the speakers have spoke great, but I think we should not blame each other. I wanted to be a bit more critical about myself, about the economists, because I'm an economist. I think as economists, in the past, we have very much focused on efficiency, GDP. You know, we often equate economies with GDP. So I think economists have not embraced the environmental externalities, particularly loss of biodiversity. If you look at the literature, economists have not paid enough attention to that. Look at all the citation references. So we must change that. So here I argue that economists can make a unique contribution to let's say, the food system transformation, to the environmental protection, and also to, let's say, eliminate or maybe to minimize the biodiversity loss. So number one is economists must internalize the externalities such as loss of biodiversity in the analysis. Don't think, loss of biodiversity is a cost zero. There is a cost. Economists have not done that yet. And we needed to have a proper pricing to our food products when there's a loss of biodiversity in producing that food. I think economists need to embrace that. Secondly, the economists can also help to analyze cost-benefit analysis. Here, the benefit is not just economic benefit. More importantly, is environmental benefit, is a benefit of protecting our nature, protecting the biodiversity. So number three is the so-called to offer the solutions to correct some of the policy failures by using the political economy approach. As you know, there are different interests in protecting our nature, in setting the boundaries of our planet, in protecting of biodiversity. So how can we analyze all these different interests, different incentives, and find a solution and to correct the market failures, the policy failures? I think economists can make a unique contribution over there. Number four is behavior. Then economists can offer some tools to analyze the behaviors of individuals, why they're not willing to protect our environment, why they continue to consume its red meat, consume all this sort of product that can contribute to the deforestation, the loss of biodiversity. So I think finally, if we wanted to change everybody's behavior, the economists must change their own behavior. Thank you. I want to keep it short and leave some time for general discussion.
Thank you very much. What about Professor Das Gupta from Cambridge, who has put out this new report? Do you put him in a special category of economists in terms of addressing these sorts of matters?
Yeah, actually, I'm part of that effort. So I contribute to that. So for example, internalize externalities, proper pricing, change the behavior. Yes, we all discussed all these issues. I mean, he presented his report to Justin, to me, to many Chinese economists over there. And we thought that the economists must change their behaviors first.
Mm-hmm. And the other question, if I could just ask it right now, is when we think about this thing of donut economics, I don't know if you know much about that. It's a recent discovery for me, but this idea of linking the work that's been done on the need for a planet-wide sort of ecological approach, but then also linking that into the socio-economic dimension, which is very, very complex, of course. But is that an idea that has a future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we see an urgency to deal with all these ecological issues, planetary boundaries issues. I think the economy is just too late to wake up. I think they do need to wake up to look at all these bigger issues and integrate, our nature, the ecological circle together with economic circle. And I see right now there's still sort of a dislink, and I do hope in the future we needed to bring these two together.
Great. If I could just suggest to the panelists that there would be an opportunity, if you want to go on through chat, to perhaps come back and discuss some of these issues, and we can bring them forward within the panel itself. So thank you very much for giving us a little bit more extra time now and keep us on schedule. And now I'd like to go back to the next person who is very familiar to us, Dr. Linxiu Zhang.
My presentation is really goes along with what Arthur at the introduction was saying, really trying to introduce some of the activities we're doing, the promoting nexus approaches. for resilient livelihood in the post-2020 global framework. So as Art was saying, that the importance of nexus approach, but because globally there is a growing emphasis on necessity of nexus approaches for implementing SDGs, especially it has been highlighted for years, if not decades, on the linkages between biodiversity and ecosystem conservation, climate change adaptation, mitigation, and human well-being. And here at UNEP IMP about 6 years ago, we proposed a conceptual framework of climate ecosystems and livelihood, where that is to building resilient livelihood through ecosystem conservation and restoration for better ecosystem services in a changing climate. Such a nexus approach has been promoted as one of UNEP's flagship program and a major South-South cooperation initiative to address different SDGs in developing countries. And today I wanted to pick up one of the projects under this that the UNEP IMP is implementing in China, with focuses on nexus approaches for agrobiodiversity conservation, and to illustrate how we combine different goals, engage various stakeholders, and achieve multiple benefit from perspective or cell nexus. The program that I'm going to introduce is really called Farmers Seed System Enhancement and Traditional Knowledge Revitalization for Climate Change Adaptation. So from the picture you will see, this is a story from 4 Nashi mountain communities in Yunnan province, Southwest China. That's where the next CBD COP15 is going to take place. So as you could see, it is located in areas where 3 rivers parallel. So Jinsha River, Lantang River, and the Nujiang River. So it's characterized with natural heritage, biodiversity hotspot, cultural heritage, and with many ethnic groups. And it's mainly in the mountainous where mountain people live. Of course, it's correlated with poor. And more importantly, women are the major kind of players in the area by all means. And with respect to the climate change adaptation, the key problems that we see are the separation of 2 systems, farmer seed system and public seed system, and ignoring the traditional knowledge system and local people. So that's what it is. So when we had this activities that when we selected those 4 villages, we had activities conducted in the area by collecting this local seeds and also registering those seeds. And with scientists' help, we documented those seeds. And after that, we conducted the participatory plant breeding and also participatory varietal selection, which really make it more suitable and resilient to the drought or any kind of climate change shocks. Also, we established community seed banks and linking to the public seed system for mutual and complementary support if needed. Very importantly, we formed the village cooperatives and helping local farmers to link to the markets where they can get receive high values for their products. At the core of all the stories, you see women are seed keepers and food producers, but at the same time, they are responsible for household food consumption. Of course, they are the front line of climate change adaptation and also biodiversity conservation and food system for all. So that's the nature. And I don't want to say how good it is that the project has yielded a positive impact, but the story is during the lockdown, farmers were able to start spring sowing with seeds kept locally, which helped farmers to better cope with crises and shocks such as COVID-19. Thus, this is really an approval of increased resilience. Art would say our definition of resilience, really trying to cope with a shock. So inspired by local communities, we collected the stories from 14 farming communities in China to show how working with nature can help people cope better with and recover better from crises like COVID-19 climate change. In order to enhance science policy interface, we organized various, and this is really, the slide I wanted to skip is really the distribution of the communities' seed banks across China. Apparently, we have more than 30 communities had a seed bank, and in 10 provinces with more than 1,000 varieties collected. So the next, please. And then in order to enhance science policy interface, we organized various dialogues. And one of those I wanted to highlight is here. We had it in last December, and as a pre-COP 15 activities, is a policy forum and on smallholder farmers and seed for resilient food system. And the other one we had, which really as a scientist or researchers I do, we had a more like a cultural thing. We had a photo exhibition on traditional farming culture and diverse disease. Basically, they were attended by scientists, government officials, NGOs, local communities, and artists, among all. So that's really very well received. And I wanted to get to my last slide, which here is really the key messages from the story I've told. Of course, not all the elements I elaborated really. It's that for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to consider is really enhancing farmer seed systems together with community support for we can have a more effective biodiversity conservation results. At the same time, design concrete livelihood options to capture the interest of communities that and with arranged or invited the private funding, we can help the farmers to have a better livelihood options where, for example, we introduced ecotourism in some parts. And linking ancient native wisdoms with scientific knowledge and partnering with private sector plus positive or supportive policies really can lead to green transformation where a lot of places had a circular agriculture in place or eco-friendly agriculture or organic agriculture that's revitalizing in those places. And also in order to ensure the sustainability, we did it through political ownership, community participation, and with a certain way of establishing long-term partnership. And one of the very important one is women empowerment for their significant roles in agro-biodiversity conservation, agroecology, and also ensure healthy diet, of course, for healthy people and a healthy planet. So the last, but never the least, implement nexus approaches for multiple benefits really reflected the SDGs that interconnectivity and the indivisible nature of SDGs would yield a positive outcome. With that, I want to thank you all for your attention. I'll get back to you now.
Thank you very much. And I would thank all the panelists for their sticking to time. That's really helped us, so we can now move into the next phase, which will be to have some discussions, possibly between the panelists, if you want to do that. And I think you've got various ways of doing it. No, sorry, you've got one way of doing it, which is different from the audience that is out there as well. What I did want to do, and if I can find it here again, is on the Q&A, there's a number of different things that are coming up. And if I can just make sure I've got this correct here, somebody can just respond if I haven't. If I read out the question and pass it on to the panelists being asked, is that the best way to do this? No? And I see Fan, I see you. did you have a question or a discussion point?
Did you ask me?
Yes,
oh yeah. Okay, yeah. There is a question about the economists. You know, in the long run, how the economic policy and environmental policy can be aligned. I do think, yes, we must do that. I think economists must understand there are planetary boundaries, there are externalities, and they need to integrate all this. I would suggest that we start from the training, from the first year of college, to train the economists from the very beginning to take into consideration of the externalities. Because otherwise, you have studied economics for 20 years, now suddenly you want it to be transformed yourself. It is hard. So that is my concrete recommendation, starting from the very beginning.
Okay. That's a very interesting point that you're raising. I used to say that about engineers when I was a professor doing these things, and lo and behold, the engineers actually do get a lot of that kind of training now. I'm surprised that maybe because I've dealt with a lot of good economists that really do take these things into account, and maybe they're not the norm, but I'm one of the best ones when I was doing my PhD work in the University of Michigan, actually, and Kenneth Boulding, who was a fantastic resource economist. And you think of some of the other groups. So these groups have been around for a long while. Why is it that they have not been able to absorb all these thoughts about biodiversity and so on?
No, Arthur, this is the traditional approach. Yes, we all train in natural resource management. That's very much local water, local land, local externalities. What I mean is the global and climate change, the climate planetary externalities, and how you're going to integrate that into pricing. That is my question, not necessarily local or even the national level.